I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, the journal Nature has been forced to issue a retraction, and about 10 scientists from around the world have also dialed back their initial claims from just a couple of weeks ago that the ocean is holding heat or warming some 60% faster than previously thought over the last 25 years. As it turns out, Bill, an individual who is not necessarily affiliated with any particular university, a guy named Nicholas Lewis, who blogs at a website, and I want to give them full credit here, called Climate Etc., which is actually at judithcurry.com. Guy in his basement just blogging on a WordPress blog. Anyway, turns out that he has a little background in physics and mathematics, and he noticed some discrepancies in the data, and the scientists have now been, who initially reported this massive increase in ocean warmth, have now been forced to say our data is much more uncertain than we previously believed. Bill, this is interesting because immediately I'm sure conservatives are going to jump all over this, but isn't this how science is supposed to work? I mean, you publish data, it gets out there in the public, and then the private citizens correct your data. Isn't that the scientific method?
Well, this is what the internet was for, Scott. There's so much damage that the internet's done. We've talked so much about, kind of immersion and how the anonymity of the internet allows people to say things they wouldn't otherwise normally say without getting a bloody nose, and so on and so on. But it's moments like this when I realize just the majesty of it. We saw something like this, nothing to do with global warming, back in 2004 when the John Kerry campaign, when Dan Rather released those memos purportedly from 1968 saying that George Bush was AWOL, and CBS had the arrogance to put that actual memo online, and within a half an hour, a guy named I want to say Buckeye or Buckhead, one of those two, over at Free Republic, took a look at this document, and he realized that it was the whatever Bush's was 163rd TH for 64th Fighter Squadron, little tiny TH. And he realized that back when you were typing in those days on a typewriter, you would write TH with big capital, with big letter T and little h, and you didn't have the computer doing this little effect for you. So then immediately Charles Johnson puts together a Word document, types the thing out in Word with the default settings, prints it, and overlays it one-to-one. It's clearly a fake. And the thing that's most impressive about that, and the reason I'm taking the time to tell that story again, is because that exposure took about a day or two, and most importantly, it was not directed by anybody. It's like a sea of molecules where they would just, like proteins, would just attach in the right place. And when they started backpedaling on this, I'll get to the global warming in a second, when CBS started backpedaling on this, and said, well, this is something that the IBM selector could have done. If you changed the balls around, if you wanted to put a special ball in so you could type your TH and all the rest of this stuff. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. This guy came in, he said, actually, the selectric can't do that. And the reason I know this is because I was the chief engineer on the IBM selectric. And, it's just like, wow. So, hooray for the internet.
So, Bill, this guy, Nick Lewis.
But I'm sorry, okay. I just kind of went off of the weeds there. Well, it's unusual to think that something like this could happen when the science is settled, Scott. And there are a couple things about the man-made climate change argument and its adherents that send up enormous red flags to people who know what science actually is. And when somebody says the science is settled, that person doesn't have the faintest idea what science is about. The science was settled for Newton for 200 years. And the time was absolutely uniform, and the predicted motions of gravity and Newtonian equations could predict the universe like a clockwork into the future. But it turns out that at the high extremes of speed and gravity, things get a little dicey, and Albert Einstein came along and showed that, no, actually turns out the science is not settled after all. So when somebody says the science is settled, that's not just unscientific, it's anti-scientific. And cases like this show that this AGW, anthropomorphic global warming argument, must have something shabby about it to have so much fraud attached to it.
Well, Bill, it it continues that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations panel that studies this, has other studies that show that the oceans are warming faster than we thought, accelerating in their warming. And I guess what I'm wondering, Bill, is aren't you concerned that a needle in a haystack find like what Nick Lewis has done at this Climate Etc. website over this individual study that may have some flaws in it, now acknowledged flaws in it, will set conservatives to believing that most science is shabby, as you say, and that we can therefore attack it with impunity?
Well, this is what happens when you politicize science, Scott. The reason that they brought science into the argument was they brought the mantle of science and its objectivity and its tremendous power, just the tremendous power of science, the whole idea of scientific thought, and they attached this mantle of respectability and credibility to a theory that they had, and that theory became a political argument, and they brought science into the political argument. They thought that science would raise their political argument, but all it did was the politics pulled down the science and made people skeptical about pretty much everything that has reasonable amounts of certainty to it. The remarkable thing about all this is I really thought that there was something seriously wrong with their argument when it went from global warming to climate change, and let me explain why. If the climate is not changing, then this will be the first time in human history when it's not changing. It is, of course, it's changing. The climate is always changing. Center of Kansas, 85 million years ago was under 2 miles of water, and then 85,000 years ago was under a mile of ice. Now, listen, I want to be real clear on this. That doesn't mean that there isn't something happening, and it doesn't mean necessarily that man is having no impact on the environment. All of this can be true, but the thing that's so disturbing to me is that they are attaching so much hyperbole to this, and they're in such a rush to politicize it that they have essentially removed science as any reasonable person understands it from the equation. And they may be doing not only a disservice, obviously, to the rest of science, but they may be doing a disservice to what may be, in fact, a significant trend and something that we need to be aware of without getting the vapors, or the water vapors, as the case may be.
So, Bill, since we're not inside the laboratory and we're not in the editorial board meetings at the journal Nature, and we don't know exactly what these processes are, and frankly, most of these scientific papers are written in a language that's designed to obscure them from the masses.
Like legal documents.
How can a thinking person be able to evaluate the various claims? I mean, on November 1st, the Washington Post has a big story that says the oceans are warming at a rate that's 60% faster than we previously thought it was in the last 25 years. On November 10th, 11th, or 12th, somewhere around there, the Washington Post has a story that says the claim that we just made a couple of weeks ago is not accurate. How can we, with confidence, state our beliefs or talk about the foundational principles behind our views on climate change when we can't even know how this data is being gathered and filtered?
Well, we can apply the same rules that work for us in assessing a democracy, the same rules that apply for us apply to science, same rules that apply to economics. Common sense is a term it's a perfectly good term, but it has become a belittling term because because in this age of elitism, nobody wants to be common anymore, right? Common sense, that's what those hillbilly rubes have, is common sense. My favorite thing about intellectuals, my favorite quote about them ever, is that you can present some data to an intellectual, and an intellectual will say, well, yes, it works in practice, but will it work in theory? And that's fundamentally where we are now. We're dealing with people who have come to the point where they're so emotionally invested and professionally invested too, where so-called scientists now are saying, well, there's a conflict between the atmosphere and my model, and therefore the atmosphere must be wrong. And I think this is the heart of it. I think that these climate models and the people that push them, these computer models of climate, I think the best way to think of them and their relationship to their creators is to think of them as a train set in the basement. And a very, very elaborate train set. We've all seen these things, right, with 7 different rails and locomotives going and the gates going up and down and the little guy waving his lantern. And I think what happens is the scientists get to the point where they're painting the pencil-thin mustache on the conductor, and they put all of the little flame details on the lamp that this guy who's this big is holding, and they get so much attached to the model that they begin to think that the model is reality. And on an emotional level, I think it's clear. If the model and real world data diverge, they're pretty sure there's something wrong with the real world. Now, this is a human foible, and it affects everybody. And the entire reason that science has been as successful as it has been is because it is a process that is designed to weed out human foible. And this is a perfect example of it. Because if something is true, if there is data that is reproducible through experiment, then a guy in his garage can be on the right side and every single PhD scientist in the rest of the planet is wrong if he can reproduce his data and they can't. And that's exactly what happened. And it makes you wonder where we would be without this kind of watchdog situation. It makes you wonder where we would be if we had an actual real press that decided to check on some of these things before they ran with them.
Now, Bill, I'm not sure whether it was one of the guys who was involved in the study at the Scripps Institute for Oceanography. Princeton University was heavily involved, as well as several international organizations and universities. I forget whether it was him or somebody at the journal Nature who basically praised this episode of what he called post-publication review. But Bill, I guess the thought occurred to me during reading this story that if not for Nicholas Lewis, would we even know that this study was in error?
No, we wouldn't. So thank you, Nicholas. Although I have to say that this droning has been going on for so long, and wolf has been cried so many times that the power it has over the imagination is smaller and smaller. When I was talking about common sense and how you can apply common sense to scientific questions, the first thing you can do is ask yourself about predictability. If it turns out that in 2005, newspapers and even Al Gore, who invented the internet, tell you that by 2015, New York's going to be under a foot of water and we'll never see snowfall again. Well, if 2015 comes along and your feet are still dry in New York and it's snowing outside, then common sense tells you that something is wrong with this prediction. This is not rocket science because it doesn't have to be rocket science. And so when you deal with a group like the climatologists, the thing that's so revealing about them is that they seem to be absolutely unwilling to do predictive, quantifiable measurements. In other words, if the sea level is supposed to rise by 10 centimeters in 100 years, that means it should rise by 1 centimeter every 10 years, or on some sort of a scale. I understand it doesn't have to be linear, but you should be able to predict 10 years out what you say is going to happen 100 years out, because if your model is correct, your model can't get to 100 years without getting through 10 years. And this is where they seem to keep falling down flat on their face. And there's another thing too, and that is and again, so I think science deserved the reputation that it had and has, but I think science as an idea also needed to be taken down a notch because science was getting a little bit too big for its britches, to be honest with you, Scotty. And so what you have is you have these kind of approximations, you have these models and so on, and it's not really science. These scientists have an emotional reaction to it. But a great example of what I'm talking about is the power of hearing something from a PhD at Cornell, let's just say. And back when we were at the previous establishment, we did a segment on, you've certainly heard of the continent-sized island of plastic that's floating in the South Pacific. The garbage patch,
that's right, yeah.
Right, it's the size of a continent, it's the size of Australia. It's a collection of plastic bottles that is so thick that it's essentially a floating continent out there in the middle of the South Pacific, and that's why you can't get a drinking straw in San Francisco, because we don't want to contribute to this continent-wide ocean of plastic bottles. And what we found was that the guy who predicted this, who mentioned the existence of this, was I think it was a 24-year-old Spanish oceanographer. And he later admitted that he was wrong by a factor of 12,400%, some number like that. But here's what's interesting. We have all heard about this continent-sized eddy whirlpool of floating plastic. And we all believe in it, and we all are taking actions, and we're not using plastic bags or plastic bottles or plastic straws. And yet there's not a single picture of it. Don't you find that odd?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot predict the future here. You know, Bill, there's a passage in the Old Testament that says you'll know a man is a prophet when what he says is the word of the Lord comes to pass. We're not navigating on that level here, but we are anchored in history and morality and principles that are the bedrocks of our ideology. And Bill Whittle brings that to you in analysis of daily news 5 days a week. We're grateful for the members at BillWhittle.com who have made this possible now for quite a long time, and going forward, their enthusiasm grows. We appreciate all the people who watch these videos. If you'd like to join the crew of people who are actually producing these videos, you can learn more about that at BillWhittle.com. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.